Good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank the organizer for the invitation to join this faculty and address this important topic. So my task at the beginning of this session is to review with you the issue of inhibitor and really set up the scene for the discussion and presentations that will follow. Here are some disclosures. So I'd like to start with this very illustrative slide showing you the positive and the negative impact of substitution with factor VIII in a patient with severe hemophilia. So clearly, when you treat a patient with hemophilia with factor VIII concentrate, your objective is to control his bleeding tendency and even to prevent or abolish bleeding episode. And this is the positive impact of the treatment. But you know that when you provide this patient who has never received factor VIII to factor VIII concentrate, well, this patient is certainly at risk of developing antibodies against exogenous factor VIII. This is the issue of inhibitor. We shouldn't also forget that depending on the source of factor VIII that you use, there is a risk or potential risk or theoretical risk of exposing these patients to infectious agents. And you know that this is less usual, but there is always a risk that these patients could develop a variety of other adverse events. We also know that not all previously untreated patients, the PUPs, with severe hemophilia A are tolerant to exogenous factor VIII. The good news is that depending on the studies that have been conducted, 70, 60 to 95% of the patients do not develop these antibodies. Why is it like this? Well, do these patients completely ignore this exogenous therapeutic factor VIII, or are they able to induce some sort of tolerance to these exogenous factor VIII? We do not really know. The major problem is that in up to 5 to 30 or even 40 and sometimes even 50% of the patients, these previously untreated patients, some of these patients develop an inhibitor, and you know that this inhibitor will interact and inhibit the normal function of exogenous factor VIII. I think that during our discussions this afternoon, it's very important to look at this issue of inhibitor at the global level. And this is a very personal slide comparing the problematic of inhibitor in developed and in developing countries. Well, clearly, you only develop antibodies against factor VIII if you are exposed to factor VIII, if you benefit from replacement therapy. We know that replacement therapy is standard of care in developed countries, but is much highly variable in developing or emerging countries. That means that in developed countries, the exposures to exogenous factor VIII usually occurs early, is regular, and can be very intensive. In less developed countries, it can sometimes be very delayed and very irregular. The inhibitor development in developed countries is carefully followed, monitored, well studied. It's not always a priority in less developed countries. Considering the diagnosis of inhibitor in developed countries, it's usually early process and reliable process. It's most of the time much more difficult and delayed in emerging countries. When it comes down to the management of inhibitor, we know that in most developed countries, we have several therapeutic options, such as ITI and bypassing agents that can be given regularly to the patient. Again, the access to these therapies is much highly variable in less developed countries. And considering the research implication, we know that many developed countries are involved in active international multicentric research. It's much more limited in less developed countries. We shouldn't also forget, and I think this is also quite important for our discussion this afternoon, that there are or there have been two major challenges for hemophilia therapy: the infectious safety and the immunological safety, the inhibitor development. So clearly for the patients who receive factor VIII concentrate, clearly there is an infectious safety, and that can never be ignored or forgotten. We know that by exposing patients to exogenous factor VIII, there is a risk of contaminating these patients with blood-borne infectious agents. that can result in chronic infections and even death, and the story is there to remind us this. There is also a risk of immunological safety, I mean intolerance to exogenous factor VIII, with the development of alloantibodies directed against exogenous factor VIII, which will render replacement therapy more or less, or most of the time, totally inefficient. And you know the major consequences: increased morbidity, less effective replacement therapy, hemostatic therapy, huge burden for the patients, the family, and major costs. This slide summarizes the extensive list of pathogens that have affected the hemophilia community since 1971. Hepatitis B, HIV, hepatitis C, TTV, parvovirus, new variant CJD, and I hope that in the future, but this is also a responsibility, no line should be added to this extensive list. The hemophilia community has paid enough to all these infectious agents. And this slide summarizes, this busy slide summarizes all the major developments which have been achieved in terms of factor VIII replacement therapy and factor IX replacement therapy over the last decades. And I would like to stress the fact that most of these changes, of these developments, were driven by the need to improve safety. No, it's clear that with the development of factor VIII and factor IX by biotechnology, it's now possible to build up upon nature and to modify the structure and the properties of this protein. So clearly, the improvement in infectious safety has been a very successful story. No transmission of HPV, HCV, HIV attributable to manufactured plasma derivative since 1985. And I would like also to stress the fact that recombinant products do not contain any exogenous protein and do not carry the risk of transmitting known but also unknown emerging pathogens. We shouldn't forget this in our discussion. If we now look at the history of inhibitor, this slide summarizes more or less rigorously the history of diagnosis, risk factors, and treatment strategy for inhibitor. Well, clearly, the Bethesda assay was developed. Several therapeutic strategies have been developed. ITI was first. Well, the benefits of intensive therapy were first observed in 1977, and then several protocols, more or less rigorous, were they launched with randomized trials, and now we are here. And the most recent event in this area is the publication a few weeks ago of the CPET study. So what can we summarize in terms of inhibitor development? Well, we know that there are many risk factors for inhibitor development. They've been identified, they've been studied. There are also, and this is a very good news, there are no strategies to bypass factor VIII and factor IX and to eradicate the inhibitor. They've been successfully developed and they work in a significant fraction of our patients. We also have strategies that have been proposed to estimate, to reduce or minimize the risk of inhibitor development. But we shouldn't forget that for many patients with PUPs, many patients previously untreated, treated with factor VIII, inhibitor development remains a fatality. So this slide summarizes that the immunological safety, the improvement in immunological safety has been much less successful than the infectious safety. What are the major risk factors for inhibitor development? You are familiar with most of them. There are genetics factors, there are therapeutic factors which are related either to the type of the treatment or are related to treatment. They are classically recognized as being non-modifiable. There is nothing you can do about them, or modifiable, you can influence them. So let's go into the details. Here you have several polymorphisms in immunoregulatory genes which have been identified. The family history is critical, and the ethnicity has also an importance. The hemophilia severity plays a very important role, such as a mutation and some HLA haplotype. All will play a role in the development of inhibitor. And if we now consider the modifiable risk factors, well, clearly the type of treatment is important, the type of factor VIII and factor IX concentrate, and certainly the therapeutic regimen, how aggressively or intensively you treat your patient. This is critical. Intensity of the treatment and the immunological challenge. The PETNET study clearly demonstrated that the family history, the mutation, and the intensivity of the treatment play a key role. But as you know, there is an increasing interest or focused on the type of factor VIII and factor IX concentrate. Clearly, the genetic background is very important, and we know that the type of mutation is clearly correlated with the risk of inhibited development. But we shouldn't forget that in many parts of the world, the genetic background has not yet been identified for many patients. And this very busy slide summarizes many polymorphisms in the immune systems that have been identified and associated to be more or less associated with the risk of inhibited development, an increased risk or a protective effect. But although all these data are important to better understand the pathophysiology of inhibited development, well, many of them are not implemented in our daily practice. Well, clearly, when you see, I think all of us, we should keep this slide on top of our heads and be aware that all these factors play an important role in the inhibited development. And we will hear a little bit more this later in the afternoon. When you consider a study about the development of inhibitor, you should make sure that you pay attention to all these variables, and that makes this task very challenging. And we know that avoiding danger signal and higher antigen load is very important. We shouldn't also forget that there are several properties of these factor VIII molecules that can impact their immunogenicity. I don't have much time to go into the details, but you can see here all the potential factors that could influence at a protein level the immunogenicity of the product. But clearly, there is no confirmed data to guide choice between products based on this. There are also some potential strategies to reduce the risk of inhibited development, and I think we should do everything possible to follow them. Prophylaxis should be initiated as soon as possible to prevent bleeds and to provide exposure to the deficient factor in the absence of danger signals. Indication for elective surgery should be carefully assessed at start of replacement therapy, and interventions should ideally be delayed whenever possible, later than 50 exposure days. And very importantly, factor dosage, duration of treatment should be minimized. We should not overtreat our patient to reduce the antigen load, and if possible, avoid completely DDAVP. And the question is, and this question will be addressed extensively in the afternoon, should we promote plasma-derived factor VIII concentrate in PUPs following the results of the CPET study? And here are several questions that, in my view, should be addressed in the afternoon. Do we trust the results and the conclusion of the CPET study? Will CPET study close this passionate debate about the risk of inhibited development between plasma-derived and recombinant factor VIII concentrate? Should CPET impact on our practice? Should we advocate plasma-derived factor VIII in PUPs, all PUPs or selected PUPs? This is a very important question. Balancing the infectious risk, the immunological safety, and what we know about the risk of inhibited development. Which plasma-derived product should be preferred in PUPs? Can we trust the infectious safety of plasma-derived product in all parts of the world? In all parts of the world, are these concentrates safe? What about extended half-life concentrate in PUPs? Because if we decide to use plasma-derived concentrate in PUPs, that means that we will not use extended half-life product. We should again balance the risk and the benefits. How should we communicate patient association? And this is clearly an exceptional arena to discuss this. And what should we do in the near future to clarify? Because clearly, I think that the debate is not yet closed, and we need to decide what we should ideally do in the future to solve this very important problem for the hemophilia community.